Hi, guys. Welcome to another Monday night study. We have been studying the Book of Enoch, and let me throw that up here. And we're going to go through this in 6 parts. The first one was an introduction, so that was just one night, but we talked about how the church fathers quote and talk about Enoch, consider it genuine prophecy. We talked about other Dead Sea Scrolls literature, where it comes from, and then Dead Sea Scroll pieces of Enoch. Anyway, then we got to number 2, and that was a pretty quick one also. Chapter 1 of the Book of Enoch is all about end time prophecy, specifically when the Messiah sets up his kingdom. And it's quoted in the book of Jude. And then we also looked in Jude and in 2 Peter 2 about the angels that fell, Tartarus, and some other things like that, and showed how that goes back to the account in the Book of Enoch. So that's in our uh, number 3 there, the fallen angel history. Last week we did chapters 6, 7, and 8, which told the story of the original 200 that came to Mount Hermon that started the problems. And that's about as far as we got, but that's enough in seeing how the early church fathers quote Enoch. Enoch gives the rest of the story for chapter 6 of the book of Genesis. And so we have a pretty good understanding of it not being Sethites and Canaanites, but actual angels. So we talked about the fact that they had um, giants. And so the next thing we would want to do is find out about them. How did that happen, etc. So the book of Enoch itself in the Ethiopic is 100 and some chapters, and we're up to chapter 8 now. So we would be starting 9 the next time we do this. But we wanted to take a small break because there are other scrolls in the Dead Sea Scrolls that are either just simply Enoch type literature, more of the story than what Enoch has, or maybe a lost chapter of Enoch, something like that. So today we're going to look at the first part of 2 parts of the Book of Giants. That's the title given as a Dead Sea Scroll. And since we went through chapters 6, 7, and 8 of Enoch, that talked about how the Watchers came, the 200, and that was last week. So you can look in the playlist and see it. And some questions, of course, come up at that point where it's like, how in the world did they do the things that they did? What exactly did they do? The genetic tampering aspect. Because what's important is other Dead Sea Scrolls and church fathers give hints that before the second coming, these things will come back. Not necessarily new full blown Nephilim, not necessarily an angelic rebellion, but the aspects of that. So the genetic tampering, we begin to do the same kind of stuff, and it ends in disaster. So you guys would be interested in that because those are things that will affect you and me, our health, and things like that. That's their opinion, and it may or may not be true, but church fathers usually have a general understanding of these things. So let's go ahead and look at this. So we went through 6, 7, and 8 about Nephilim history. And then if we go to this is the ancient book of Enoch. So what this is several years ago, I wrote a translation of Enoch. It's based on R.H. Charles, which is the official Enoch. And what it does is has commentary, a fresh English translation, which is important. When we get to the end of this, we're going to have the dream and the shepherd's prophecy and other prophecies. We got to make sure to get the right words to understand it just right. So it's really important for us. So in the back of the book, I have an appendix. Matter of fact, let me just show you here. I think you can see this. So there's the Book of Enoch, which is the outline, the 108 chapters, and then study of his prophecies, an appendix A, the sons of God of Genesis 6, what the 4 theories of that is. And of course, we know what Enoch says, it would be angels. History of the Nephilim, a brief overview of all the stuff from the different manuscripts. And then appendix C, we're going to be looking at the first half of that tonight, which is the Book of Giants. Very, very important. And then appendix D was as of 2012, when we put this together, how we were following in their footsteps, some of the different experiments of genetics and things like that. So very important. So let's go through this. So we know from Genesis 6, it says that the sons of God came to the daughters of men, bore children. These were mighty men of old, and it caused major problems. And that's all it really says. So let me just read this here in Appendix E, the Book of Giants. So the entire Book of Enoch is preserved by the Ethiopic Church. We know that. Some fragments of the same book exist among the Dead Sea Scrolls in Hebrew and in Aramaic. So in these extra fragments, they're usually referred to as the Book of Giants. It's obviously talking about the same information about the Nephilim, the giants in Genesis 6, but it gives more information. So these fragments might be in, like we said, an extra chapter of Enoch or just more. They're badly fragmented, so it's hard to pull a whole story from them, but we're going to do a fairly good job, I think. Okay, and so just to let us know, Dead Sea Scrolls, when you're trying to identify them, like to double check me or whatever, get an actual quote translation or whatever, there have been 50 some caves that have been excavated, most of which there's nothing in them but dirt. But if they find a cave that has some sort of writing, either on pottery, fragments, skin, whatever, leather or whatever, then it's called a Dead Sea Scroll. And there's been 12 of the Dead Sea caves. So what we're doing here, the Q means Qumran. So that's the area where the Dead Sea Scrolls are. And so, like, for instance, here, the Book of Giants is made up of these fragments. So the first one is 1Q23, and that means it's Qumran, the very first cave excavated back in the 1940s and 50s. And the 23rd scroll from that cave is the one we're looking at. So that's how they're categorized or named. There's also one that's 2Q26. So that would be the 26th scroll from the second cave in Qumran. And then 530, 31, and 32 of cave 4. So 4Q, 530, 31, and 32. And then in the sixth cave, there's actually 6Q8. So the eighth scroll that they found in Qumran. So you can see here, there's several scrolls that are connected with Enoch, the Book of Giants, from Cave 1, Cave 2, Cave 4, and Cave 6. So quite a bit of information. So, okay, it's made up of two sections. Tonight we're going to look at the genetic tampering part. Next week we'll probably look at the second part, which is actually really interesting. It's a little information about a conversation between two Nephilim and the fact of a dream or a prophetic type thing that happens. So that's pretty interesting. It actually answers a lot of theological questions about Nephilim. Did they speak? Did they know things? Were they just weird people, wild animals? So we get an interesting look at the psyche, so to speak, of a Nephilim. But anyway, this first section is about genetic tampering. So let me just give you the summary, and then we'll look at the fragments. Actually, first off, let me, because I think we have, yeah, let me just go there here with this. We also have a book of Jasher, and Jasher is like a compilation of everything. The original book of Jasher was back in the time of Moses and Joshua, so it's 3,500 years old. May or may not be tampered with or have extra information, but let's just kind of look at that. So we know Genesis 6 is the basic story. We've looked at Enoch last week about the 200 and the very detailed of the sons of God when they fell. And we'll come right back to here because it's all connected. So this is Jasher chapter 4. And it starts off talking about in the days of Noah. Now, Noah would have been born 1,056 years after creation, according to Genesis, Jasher, the Seder, and other ancient records. This just says the wife of Lamech conceived and bore a son at that time at the revolution of the year. And I put in RHS, which is Rosh Hashanah. Back at the time we did this, I didn't know anything about the Dead Sea Scroll calendar. So the revolution of the year is actually Nisan. It's spring, not fall. So that's actually an error on my part. So anyway, it says Methuselah called his name Noah, saying the earth in his days was at rest and free from corruption. Lamech his father called his name Menachem, saying, this one will comfort us in our works and our miserable toil on the earth, which God has cursed. The child grew up and was weaned, and he went in the ways of his father Methuselah, perfect and upright before God. All the sons, this is interesting here, look at this. All the sons of men departed from the ways of the Lord in those days, as they multiplied on the face of the earth with sons and daughters. So people just got caught up with the cares of the world so far and left the Lord. Okay. They taught one another their evil practices, and they continued sinning against the Lord. Every man made himself a god. So it's like a small idol, big or small, but an idol. They robbed and plundered every man his neighbor as well as his relative, and they corrupted the earth, and the earth was filled with violence. Now you read this and you think, okay, robbery, robbing from your relatives, violence, killing people, hurting people, armed robbery, stuff like that. But corrupting the earth, like moral corruption for sure, but it doesn't mean more. Now, this is interesting. This says they're judges. And I want to point this out to you because this is the equivalent of Genesis 6, but he's going to be called, instead of the sons of God, the judges. So that's an interesting thing. At first, you might think, well, and that's one of the theories that it's Sethite Canaanites, it's angels, it's just judges or tribal warrior kings, something like that. But this is judges of some sort. So the people that set in judgment, that rule over the clans, the judges and the rulers went to the daughters of men and took their wives by force from their husbands according to their choice. So, in other words, it could just be, I want the cute girl. I don't care who she's married to. She's mine now. I'm taking her. And that's probably part of it. But it's also probably looking for the one who has the genetics that I'm interested in. And I don't care that she's already married. I need the genetics. I need to do the experiments with. We're going to see that in a little bit. But it's interesting. They took wives by force from their husbands. So it's not we'll arrange a marriage. Everybody's happy about it. These guys are going to do what they're going to do. So in other words, corrupted. The sons of men in those days, now this is interesting. Now, the sons of men, that would not be the angels or these judges and rulers, but just people, normal human people. So this sounds weird at first, but I want you to notice this. The sons of men in those days took from the cattle of the earth, the beasts of the field, and the fowls of the air, and taught the mixture of the animals of one species with another, in order wherewith to provoke the Lord. And God saw that the whole earth and in it was corrupt. And it goes on and talks about the flood will come in this. But I point this out because, number one, the way this is written, you've got cattle, you got beasts of the field, and then you got fowls of the air, the three main different kinds of creatures other than the things in the water. And when it says they taught the mixture of the animals, some people might say, okay, you mix two cows together and you get a brown cow. You mix two, a tiger and a leopard, and you get, a cross cat type species. And then fowls of the air, you mix a brown owl and a gray owl, and you get a whatever owl. So I'm sure that's part of it. That's how it starts. But the way this is written, and you can't see it too well in English, but the way this is written is you're mixing the cattle with the beasts with the birds. So the concept of like a Pegasus or something. I don't know if Pegasus ever existed, but a winged horse beast creature thing. So this is what we're talking about. And the whole idea is, how would the sons of men, apparently we're getting in on this technology too, but how would the sons of men know the proper procedures for mixing, yeah, two different colored dogs to make a different colored dog. But to mix species, that's not possible normally. So how would they figure that out? They wouldn't just figure it out accidentally. You would have to be taught the information on how to do it. And so what's interesting to me is the judges and the rulers over the people apparently taught them. And you're not going to have tribal leaders that understand genetics back in that day. So these judges and these rulers are actually angelic judges and rulers. They've changed the format and the society, the structure of society over. So with that in mind, let's go back to Enoch and we'll look at this first section. So how does this kind of stuff work? So this first section deals with how the fallen angels descended from heaven, studied all different types of creatures, insects, mammals, birds, and even mankind. Study what they're made of, what makes them tick, figure out somehow how to get around the normal species thing. You can't mix species. There's something in our genetics that stops it. So there's some way around some of those things if you do it right. So in the text, it talks about they took 200 of each kind of animal, birds, animals or birds, and they crossbred them with other kinds of similar animals or chromosome counts to create a creature with an unstable chromosome count or an unstable life form, as we call it. One example in the scrolls that are given are sheep. When the sheep we know today have 54 chromosomes. Now, goats have 60, but you can cross a sheep and a goat and produce a half sheep, half goat creature. Supposedly, I don't remember, they either give more milk or they're more meaty or something, but some people do that in different places. So this half being, though, is not going to have the 54 or the 60 chromosome count. It's going to have either 56 or 57 chromosomes. We just know that because it's a common practice in certain places. So only a few of the 200 pair combinations would have the ability to reproduce, which is probably why you're doing it in sets of 200. And then instead of having an offspring with the same two, you could just kind of rotate your 200 and do different things. Okay, so another example they give is a horse and a donkey. And you mix those together, you get a mule. But if you look at the chromosome count of the donkey and of the horse, they're both quite a bit different. The mule is somewhere in between. And as we know, most of the time when you have a mule, most of the time today anyway, they can't reproduce. But occasionally you do have mules that can reproduce. And so again, if you're trying to do this in sets of 200 and you know what you're doing and you could, use herbs or something, do something with it, you might make it work a little better. There's probably some little trick to it, so to speak. So anyway, the unstable life forms were then crossbred with other unstable life forms with a close, similar, or very similar chromosome count. So they can't be too far off or it's just flat not going to work. So this process continued apparently until the desired creature was created. And it mentions here the ancient book of Jasher. We just read that about the crossbreeding of the cattle with the birds. So that's pretty interesting. And again, you don't accidentally stumble upon that. You'd have to know what you're doing and follow some sort of instructions. And we're getting to that. Those instructions are kind of still around in different places. So this might have been the origin of something like a Pegasus, winged horse. And we've got other genetic experiments in the back of the book. But here's the first section then. So a reconstruction of it. So this is 1Q23, fragments 9, 14, and 15. And some of these are very fragmented, very hard to understand, but I think you'll get a general idea of what they're talking about. So in this first fragment, it says, when the fallen angels came. Notice it says fallen angels. So these guys are not doing what God wants them to do. When the fallen angels came, they brought great sin upon the earth. Okay, what specifically? Using the secrets of heaven that they knew, they killed many people and animals and begot giants. So that goes along with Genesis 6. But it's interesting. They somehow knew things because they were angelic, things that we don't know. And you have to understand that if something is real and it works, you can call it science, you can call it whatever, but it's the same. If an angel knows how to do genetic manipulation, and we can do it through, in a laboratory, if it can be done, it can be done. If it can't, it can't. So, I mean, it's just basic science at that point. But they knew things that the people at that point did not know. But they used their knowledge to kill people and animals, they changed society, etc. So the next fragment, 4Q 531, fragment 3 says, they studied everything the earth produced. The fruit, grains, trees, along with creeping insects, up to the great fish, the beasts, the reptiles, and the flying birds. So this is an interesting thing. Now that's one whole section together. So they studied things. They grouped them together. They tried to figure out what to do. So in other words, if you were a scientist and you knew that birds have wings, beasts do not have wings, is there a way? Is there certain beast-like birds and bird-like beasts? Is there a way to? You'd have to figure these things out. So you'd have to study them in a sense to figure out how to put your stuff together. And so apparently that's what these did. So these are fallen angels. They came to the earth. It was a great sin. They killed many in this process. So this is interesting to me. You can think about how small dogs have small babies. And if you somehow could get a chihuahua to mate with a mastiff, if it worked, the mother chihuahua would probably die in childbirth. I mean, it's just like one of those things. So they tried all these experiments and it killed a lot of animals and people. So we're experimenting with people and animals and things like that, corrupting everything. So they studied these things, and the end result here, it says something about they were very harsh, some sort of very harsh deed, something about their oath. We studied the oath last week from Mount Hermon, male and female, and among humans. So animals and humans. Not that you're necessarily crossing an animal and a human, but everything genetic they're trying to figure out. So that's fragment 3. Now this next fragment gives us an idea. They took 200 donkeys and 200 that should be horses, asses, different kinds, in other words, to mix together. And they took 200 rams and 200 goats, 200 of the beasts of the field, including various types of animals and birds, for the purpose of mixing species. Okay, and so this is interesting to me. This fragment actually comes right out and says that. So you can mix two different kind of cats together, tigers and lions, making a ligon or something like that, or a liger or a tigon, I guess it is. But in this case, examples are donkeys and asses, rams and goats, beasts of the field in general, and that the beasts of the field include types of animals and birds for the purpose of mixing species. So that's not something that you can accidentally do. That's pretty specific. Okay, and then it says that's fragment 1Q23, and in 4Q 531 fragment 2, it says this: the angels defiled their women, who begot giants and monsters. So this is the first thing that we've seen. We see this in another text we'll get to later. But they begot giants. That's one set of things, and monsters. So in other words, I think what this is saying is sometimes the process worked and you had a very intelligent, godlike, superpower being, you know, other times it doesn't work. The genes are corrupted and out comes a monster. And a monster meaning like really messed up genetics. They probably didn't live very long. Maybe they lived, maybe, but it wasn't the desired outcome. Another thing is what we're going to see here later is that the giants were intelligent. I mean, they might try to enslave you, they might try to kill you, they might try to bargain with you. They're intelligent. The monster is probably more like a wild animal. You don't make a wild animal a pet. And, if you tried to tame a wild animal, you're going to get in trouble. Dogs are domestic, wolves are not. So you're going to get in trouble if you did that. So this is the kind of thing we're talking about. So it goes on and says that they defiled the women. The women didn't have normal human people or children like they should. They got giants or monsters. And maybe some of them died in the process, apparently, what we just read up there. So the entire earth was corrupted by this blood and by the hand of the giants who devoured much flesh. If they're giants in the normal way of thinking, if they're twice as tall as you and I, they're going to have big appetites. Some of these guys that are 6'5" or whatever can eat like 2 dinners, what I would consider 2 whole dinners, nothing to them. But they need that. They have a lot of need a lot of fuel. So these giants, if these giants were even like 10 feet, 13 feet, 18 feet, as some of the texts talk about, that's going to be a lot of hamburgers. So they devoured much flesh, and there was corruption of blood by the other things that didn't work. Now, what the giants did not eat, the monsters attacked. Now, notice the way it says eat would be like, I'm going to get cattle, I'm going to keep them, make them well, keep them well and everything until I want to make dinner with them, make my hamburgers and my steaks. A wild animal just kind of goes nuts and just attacks things. So we're getting this whole concept here. Giants may want to kill all the people, maybe, but it would be an intelligent thing, and maybe they would be someone you'd want to watch out for even more. Wild animals are just wild, and maybe they're predictable. Maybe there's an easy way to get rid of a pack of wolves because they always attack the same way. They're not that bright in a sense, like a seasoned warrior. But that's what we're getting here in this kind of thing. Now that's 4Q 531. Now this one here, 4Q 532, column 2, fragments 1 to 6, says this. And again, you can tell how it's fragmented, so we're not sure exactly what we're talking about. The flesh of all the monsters. So somehow they're different than the other, and that makes sense. They would be. They would always arise without true understanding and knowledge, and the earth grew so corrupt, they were considering doing something about this. So in this first section here, again, we get the same idea. There's intelligent Nephilim, and there are these just ravenous monsters or ravenous animals. So in other words, you're mixing the species and stuff. Some of them are more animalistic, some of them are more human-like or angelic or whatever. Okay, so and then it says from the angels, something was from the angels, probably the technology, but in the end, it would always perish and die, and it caused even greater corruption in the earth. So again, a little bit of speculation on what we're seeing here, but it sounds like the technology came from the angels. So it does work if you do it right. But when man tried it, which is what we're talking about there in Jasher and other places, we always do the same thing. If China, for instance, were able to figure out a way to genetically modify its soldiers, they're now twice as fast, see twice as far, twice as strong, etc. Even if you think that's a bad idea, I can guarantee you that the United States and Russia and other places would be experimenting with it. You can't just let the enemy have superior weapons. So that's what happens when these kind of things finally become known again. Total chaos happens. Even if you were to ban it in your country, somebody somewhere would do something with it, and it has to be dealt with. especially with a secular society that doesn't know God. No telling what this is. So, in other words, this technology comes from the angels, but when people try to do this, somehow it would always mess up. So, people would perish and die, or beings, the animals, whatever we're talking about, would perish and die. And it caused even greater corruption in the earth. So, you can think about this if you're experimenting by genetically modifying, I don't know, hornets or something, and they don't live but half the time they die. You've messed them up, but they're more deadly in the process. And a couple of these hornets get out. Sure, they're going to die fairly quick, but by the time they mate with regular hornets, maybe the whole species will just cease to exist of the genetically modified ones, or maybe it'll fix the problem, or maybe something else will happen. You don't know. So it ends up corrupting all of the hornets in the United States, say, for instance. Or the same thing, you've got this weird dog that now is more powerful, more vicious, and it goes out there and mates with a handful of dogs, and now all of the dogs are somewhat corrupted. So anyway, this is kind of what we're talking about. So the technology is from the angels, but in the end, when people tried them, the beings would always die and perish, but it caused greater corruption in the earth. This did not it did not suffice to do something. So in other words, to hunt them down and figure out the problem or kill them off. Um, and that's about as far as we have that. So according to the books of Enoch and Jubilees, again, so Enoch, Jubilees, Book of Giants, quotes from the church fathers. There's a lot of literature and a lot of history to pull together. But from quotes from these, we understand that there were 200 angels. We saw that last week from Enoch. But these 200 angels had children who were called giants. That's just basic Nephilim. Okay, later, other species were created that were called the Nephal. So you've got angels, you got humans, you got giants, Nephilim, and you got Nephal. So somehow Nephilim and Nephal are slightly different somehow. Different clan, different group. Later on, we figure out a little more about the clans and the clan wars and stuff. The details are sketchy, but most scholars seem to suggest that the Nephal were the children of the giants, but dramatically inferior to the giants themselves. That goes along with what we're talking about up here, the whole idea of it looks good, on paper it worked good, but somewhere along the line, the things just died. And before they died, they ended up trying to reproduce with a handful of things. And because of that, those things died. Or if they didn't die, what are they? It's just like a mutant virus or something spreading somewhere. What it's going to eventually kill itself, and then everything will be fine. You would think, but in the process, what happens? So anyway, so you've got the Nephal being the children of the giants, but dramatically inferior to the giants. Okay. Later, another species were created, possibly by mankind. This third species is called Eliud. And of course, that name comes from the Book of Jubilees. But again, remember, the Book of Jubilees is a Hebrew book found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Whole chapters are in the Dead Sea Scrolls, not this, unfortunately. But it's translated into Ge'ez, and then from there into English. And when we look at Jubilees, rather, you have all the numbers are garbled, and a lot of times the names are garbled. So this may or may not be exactly the name that was called, but that's the name given in the Ethiopic version. But that just lets us know that there are angels, there are Nephilim, there are Nephal, and there is this other species called whatever, Eliud, I guess. They were inferior to the Nephal. See chapter 10 for details. So in chapter 10, when we get back to the Enoch history itself, we're going to see these beings and learn a little bit about them. The giants were at war with the Nephal. Now, at first you think like, why are you at war with your kids? Well, again, subspecies. If you have a clan and you have 50 kids, and half of those kind of go nuts because of some genetic problem and they just go animalistic, try to kill everybody, you might be at war with that subspecies. So there's something like that going on here. So anyway, the giants were at war with the Nephal. The Nephal hated the Eliud, and the Eliud hated and hunted mankind. I think it's interesting. Um, in I think it's Jubilees, but in one of the texts, it probably is where it's mentioning these things. It's mentioning this, and it says something really cool. The idea that the giants would be at war with this clan, that clan would be at war with that clan. If they're genetically modified enough, they're actually like totally different species. It'd be like us out in Africa, everything's going fine, but there's a handful of tigers that keep attacking and eating people. So we're at war with tigers. Anything that looks like a tiger, we just shoot it and ask questions later. Something like that. But what's interesting is it says each group, hunted and killed its opposite species. But it makes the comment that mankind was the only group out of all these groups that was, shall we say, stupid enough to try to kill its own kind. I just thought that was interesting. So, because you're black or white, or you're this race or that race, or this tribe or that tribe, you're an enemy. So, we're going to kill off that one tribe. It's like, that's nuts. We're all humans. Why would we be killing each other? These did not. That's interesting, except possibly the animalistic monster type ones, but the ones that are intelligent, you help your fellow mankind. You don't kill them. So it's interesting to see the sin nature. It's a different kind of sin nature, but it's just really interesting in the history. This goes on and says it's interesting in the second section that the Eliud had dreams of their future destruction and went to get advice of the giants. So we're going to study that next week, the second section, because it's this type we wanted to look just at the genetic tampering part. But yeah, so if you have beings that are intelligent enough to talk, to have a culture, and be at war with certain groups for whatever reason, and the Eliud, of course, hate the Nephal, so they stay away from them, but apparently they are friends with the giants. So it's like two factions are come together to attack the other faction. So that's interesting. That's intelligence. The fact that they could have a dream, and a prophetic one at that, and understand about God is interesting. So that's something we'll get into next week and kind of look at the ramifications of that, because there's lots of questions about um, could they speak? Do they have a soul or a spirit? If they die, are they going to be resurrected? Did they have a chance of anything? If they were born that way and they didn't have a chance, shouldn't they have the option of salvation? Do they? Do they not? There's all this kind of speculation based on certain scriptures. But anyway, just to know that basically there were three basic tribes of Nephilim pre-flood. And we're going to see later about the Lord's judgment was to send a war between the tribes to what so that they would wipe themselves out. You see that actually throughout the Old Testament. You'll see one or two nations coming against Israel, and the Lord sends what he calls confusion amongst the enemy. And so half the enemy thinks the other half of the enemy is Israel. And so they attack and kill each other. And Israel's just sitting there watching the thing. So that happens probably 5 or 6 times in the history, Kings and Chronicles and those things. You see it in the Ezekiel 38 war, and you'll see some other things like that. So this is kind of like a normal technique. When God gets done with it, he'll send confusion. And of course, the only thing to counter that would be to not kill. So that's pretty interesting to me. Okay, so it says that's good. We're going to see that next time. No, in this case, the Eliud had dreams about future destruction. They went to get advice from the giants. There's no men or Nephal present at this meeting. So that makes sense that, the two enemies according to the text, wouldn't be there. So it's kind of like an internal evidence that the story is consistent. So we'll go ahead and stop there for tonight. And then next week, we'll look at that second section. So again, we're looking at the Enoch prophecies. We did that, or the introduction rather, to them. And then the end time outline, chapters 1 to 5. And we just now are getting into the fallen angel history. Last week was chapters 6 to 8. This week was the first part of the Book of Giants. Next week, we'll look at that second part. And then the following week, we'll get back starting with chapter 9. We'll have a better understanding of the history when it starts talking about tribes and groups and Eliud and things like that. It's like, okay, I remember those guys, and we'll be able to put it back together. So this is just kind of a general, just what we've studied so far in the last 4 or 5 weeks. And this is why I say there's so much history, pre-flood history, not just this, but again, quotes from church fathers and all this other stuff, not just about Enoch, but about the things that happen, to make the idea of Sethites and Canaanites kind of laughable, or other things like that. There's just too much written documentation. And again, you could say the whole thing is fiction, but when you have all of the early church fathers say it's not fiction, and even the bones are still around. Josephus talks about, large skeletal remains that are still there. And again, maybe he's confused, but it's a consistent teaching throughout all of the histories. So anyway, we'll go ahead and stop there for tonight. Let me hop over to the chat room and see if we have any questions. We usually do. So let's see here. First question, when does the first Nisan, year 1, of the Dead Sea Scroll calendar? According to, let me see here. We should be able to figure that out. We have a DSS calendar site that we put together. It runs in PHP, but we kind of try to backwards calculate it from 11Q13 and other Dead Sea Scrolls. So according to this here, the Dead Sea Scroll date is the 12th of Shavat, 5948. And we can go to Ona studies. Onas are 500-year periods. And according to their theology, there's supposed to be 14 of these in 7,000 years. So 14 500-year periods. They make up 10 jubilees of each kind. So when it talks about the certain age, the certain Ona, the 5th jubilee, the 5th Shemitah of that jubilee, that's that kind of a thing. So when we go to our Ona studies, example of the calendar, go to the first one here. So we should have creation first in Nisan. Again, this is just their text, so there's no way for me to prove or disprove it. But creation should have been first of Nisan in the year 3925. So, and that's a big debate. It's like, so Nisan, what would be Nisan of 3925? Is that the first day of everything, or is it the first day after the first year? There's always a big debate of give or take a year. And so that's a good question on that. But that's what we have here. We'll go on through. So Seth was born at 1:30 a.m. from creation, Anno Mundi, which would be 3796 BC. And you can see each one of these are broken up into, let me do this here, 7 Shemitahs, or 7 sets of 7 years, which is how it works, and then a Jubilee year. So this is the very first Jubilee, year 50 from creation. And this is year 100 from creation. And we go on down from there. So there's 14 of these mapped out. Number 12 is where we're at now, which I don't have much in here, but Balfour Declaration, World War II, Gaza Forsaken, the Gaza War, stuff like that. So we're trying to pull those things together to kind of study with. Okay, next question. Is there anything written in the Book of Enoch that will happen to people on earth after the rapture? Yes, there are a few things like that. We'll get into them when we get into the prophecy section. Chapters 83 to 90 has got some very interesting things. They do talk about things in the past, but it goes all the way up through our time period. And it's fascinating the way it's described, and extremely accurate, or at least up to today. So I'm assuming, the next few. So we will be going through some of those. I heard that they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Sefer Enoch, which was found next to the Sefer Job. Is that true? There is a book of Job, an Aramaic version, actually. So it's a little different than the Hebrew text. The Targums are the Aramaic translations, and they're usually word perfect as far as the translation goes. But the Targums usually have commentary. You know how we would have, like, the text would be all in one line, and then we've got footnotes at the bottom. The footnotes at the bottom are a commentary. They would generally put them in with each verse. So you'd have a verse, and if there's a commentary that goes with it, it'd be right in there. So it's really hard to tell the commentary from the scriptures, except by comparing it to the Hebrew, and then you can kind of break them down. But yes, there's a Sefer Job and a Sefer Enoch. Fragments of almost everything is in fragment form. The only thing that's almost perfect or complete would be the one great Isaiah scroll. So that's from start to finish, identical with ours. Well, few minor spelling differences and stuff, but no extra chapters or anything like that. It's the book of Isaiah. So it's fascinating to look at. Does Daniel 2:43, the miry clay, describe the end time genetic transgression when they mingle with the seed of men? Well, knowing this is a possibility, that sounds like it might have something to do with genetic tampering, something like that. There's several different theories on that. You've got, it's basically saying that when the Roman Empire falls, out of it comes 10 nations that don't they're too democratic. They just don't get along very well. The Antichrist comes along, pulls them together, makes that last great empire for a short time. And it talks about the clay, according to the Testament of Noah, is an empire in itself. But when it's talking about miry clay, which it does describe it that way, it might mean something different. So genetic changing, or it could be as simple as they're too democratic, and they mingle their seed with the seed of men, or mingle themselves with the seed of men, meaning the king of that country becomes too democratic, and then he doesn't have the power to do anything. So that's probably not what it's saying, but it's a possibility. There's several different theories on that. But this actually does fit nicely with this too. So I'm not sure what it's talking about on that particular thing. But I think if we get more and more text, more and more Dead Sea Scrolls, eventually we'll figure it out. Do you think there are any legitimate texts stored away in the Vatican vault or the Smithsonian basement? I think there's probably a lot of texts in different places. There are several places on the planet that have a vast collection of medieval manuscripts, a lot of which have never been cataloged. Now, I say medieval, but like, for instance, we did a translation of the Damascus Covenant a ways back. And so it was fragmented pretty good in places, which all Dead Sea Scrolls are. But there was a medieval version from the Cairo Museum, and it was word perfect. It was just written in, I think, probably somewhere around the 11th century. Obviously, it was a very faithful copy of something much older. So the Dead Sea Scrolls proved that it had not been tampered with, or at least not very much. As far as you could tell, there's no tampering. And it fills in the gaps where we'd have, all the breaks. So that's just one example. And you've got places like that in Spain, in Russia, and that's in Egypt. And there's lots of other places too. There's several places that have never been excavated. And I would bet my bottom dollar there's stuff there. So Vatican vault makes sense if you've got whether the Vatican's perfect or corrupt or somewhere in between. It's still a religious group, and if you produced something that's ancient, that's genuinely ancient, Even if it was by a cult back in the day, I'd want a copy of it. Anything that's non-tampered with, because that tells me what's going on back there. So I would assume in the Vatican archives, there is a ton of things that we would like to see. Things do kind of trickle out of there too. We did put together a translation of Gad the Seer, the one mentioned in Chronicles. There was a translation of that leaked out of the Vatican, and there were fragments found in other places. And then there's also one that came from a Jewish group a ways away out in India. So when you look at them and they're all basically the same, except for fragments or whatever, that's pretty interesting. So we put that together. So we happen to know that there are other manuscripts mentioned in the Bible that aren't lost. They're just kind of hidden. Certain groups have them. If I can ever get my hands on them or photographs, if you guys have photographs, you want to send me some pictures you took with your phone, that would be good. So yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff like that still out there. And you never know what's going to be found in the Dead Sea Scrolls too, or the Dead Sea Caves. One of the interesting things to me was they got 11 caves, and then they basically just stopped looking. And politically, they were told, well, if you are forced to give land to Palestine, like another Hamas or Palestinian state or something like that, and that area happens to go to them, they will want all the manuscripts. And so, and then of course, you're not supposed to dig in contested area, that kind of stuff, or make a settlement or whatever. So, because of that, for the longest time, they didn't dig. And I thought it was interesting when Trump became president, he basically said, it's your land, it's obvious, it's Hebrew, you're Hebrew, if you could do something with it and make money, go for it, it's yours. They started digging. That's how we got Cave 12 and the things that were discovered in Cave 12 and other things too. They realized that they had probably 4 years at least. Trump might get reelected, maybe he won't. If he doesn't, it'll probably go back to the same status of you can't dig. So they realized they only had 4 years to really search. So thankfully, they thank the Lord that they got Cave 12. So there's lots of stuff like that. In Revelation 17:12, it says that the 10 kings received no power as of yet, but will receive power as kings whenever the beast. Does this mean they have no kingdom until the Antichrist comes to be? I think it's the power they're talking about, because the text in Daniel and in Revelation seems to indicate after the Roman Empire fall, these 10 kings come together, but they don't have power. They argue amongst themselves. So that question we had a little while ago about mingling their selves with the seed of men. If that's a king becoming democratic, that would definitely make it where you couldn't come together, super democratic or whatever. And it may not mean that, but I'm thinking it's the power somewhere. Even if they were absolute monarchs, the fact that there's 10 separate ones that don't agree, it'd be kind of the same thing. So that would be pretty interesting there. And then when the Antichrist comes along, he forces it. Whatever he decides to do will be done, or everybody will be dead. One of the two. It will happen his way. That's the attitude behind it. Romans 8:19 through 22, the creation groaning for the return of the Lord. Does this speak of animals and pets as well? Well, he says all of creation, but in a lot of the old text, the creatures or creation refers to mankind, and a lot of times they're talking specifically of Jews, their group, because the Gentiles don't seem to care. But I would think it's all of everyone, but I don't know for sure. It's one of the things. There's David talks about the creatures of God, and seems like he's talking about people or his people. And there's a piece of Gad in that manuscript that talks about the same kind of a deal, this whole idea of that happening. Question: do you think any of the women survived the delivery of a Nephilim baby? Some may have. I mean, just knowing that some things are different, but there are legends, not in any of the scrolls that I know of, but there's legends about human women not surviving giving birth because it's just not, you know, not possible. I guess the baby's already too big, or I don't know. And maybe at that point they didn't even really care. They just wanted something to get the child, you know. So it's hard to tell. Now, once you have a few male and female of a species, like the Nephal, the Eliud, or something like that, then they could reproduce amongst themselves, and you wouldn't necessarily have any problems. If you know, like somebody twice as, if the baby's twice as big and the mothers always die, but now the mothers are Nephilim, they're twice as big too, you wouldn't have a problem. So, but yeah, there's legends about that. Kind of spooky. I wouldn't want to try it. I was reading Josephus, Antiquities Book 1 last night, and it mentioned Moses going to war with Ethiopia for Egypt. And he took the path of serpents, and there were flying serpents, were those dragons. Actually, no, the text talks about um, he went down to Elephantine, and he was friends with the king. King was Kikianus, I believe. They went somewhere to do something. He was a good general, you know. While they were gone, the kingdom, the town, or the castle, basically was besieged. And the way that it was built, it was a stone castle type thing with a moat around it, and the moat was filled with deadly snakes. And I forget the exact kind, but it was a certain kind of snake. And so if you're going to try to scale that, you're going to get shot with arrows. And if you're worried about the arrows, you're going to not be paying attention, and the snakes would bite you. So there's just flat no way of taking the city back. It's totally impregnable. And so what Moses said was not necessarily the case. There's a certain type of bird that eats those snakes, and they are immune to that particular venom. So he gets a bunch of people to go up and find these birds, get the eggs before they hatch, so that when they hatch, you're the first person they see, and your mom, you know, so they get implanted, or in, I think it's implantation. Anyway, so they're trained to be, you know, like those falcons they have for hunting pets. So they're hunting pets. So they develop a handful of these, and then they just take them out there, and eventually all the snakes are killed or eaten up. Then they're able to mount a counterattack without worrying about the snakes and take the city back. And so it's an interesting story. It just shows how Moses knows what he's doing. And a lot of times you don't want to fight the battle directly. You want to pit problems against themselves. So yeah, it's a fascinating. Josephus mentions that. It's also in Jasher, I believe, and one other place. It's a fascinating story, though. Crazy question. Have you heard if they ever did a DNA extraction from any giant bones that were found? I would imagine they would. I mean, that would be like the number one thing to do. Well, not a long time ago, because we didn't know about DNA until the 1960s, I think. But I'm sure someone kept those. So, and I've heard about scientists trying to get DNA from like dinosaurs or whatever. Well, like Jurassic Park. I know they've tried experiments with stuff like that, get a woolly mammoth or whatever and try to recreate it. Um, so if they're doing that with animals, wanting to bring back some extinct animals, I would assume they would want to do something like that too. Again, if that's a possibility, you know the military is interested, and not just ours, but Russia, China, everybody. No, nobody wants the other guy to get the information. So I would imagine so, but I have no knowledge of anything like that. Monsters arise without true understanding and knowledge. No soul since not created by God. Very well could be. Again, it's fragmented enough. I'm not sure exactly how far it goes, but it's also, I mean, it's definitely different from the Nephilim that have knowledge and self-control and no understanding, no knowledge, and seems to be just basically wild animals. There is a text in Genesis 36 and in Jasher 36 that describes some of these animals. Now it's post-flood rather than pre-flood, but same kind of stuff happens. So the technology remains and resurfaces every so often. See, that's another one of those things that's hard to say. Would they even have a soul or a spirit? Well, they have a spirit, obviously, because that's where demons come from. But would they have a soul? You know, and if they don't, would they be able to be saved? Or, there lots of questions come up. And I don't think any of us know the answer to some of those. The only thing we would know is what's written. So if we can pull the text together, we can figure that out. Have you ever heard of electric shocks neutralizing venom and poison in the blood system? I have heard something like that, but I don't know anything about it. There was something like that, and then they were also experimenting with radio waves. The idea that a certain frequency would kill off a bacteria, but not a cell or whatever. I don't know how that would work exactly, but I've heard of things like that. I don't know how accurate they are. I know you mentioned this in one of your studies, but how does this story go for the second incursion and one of Noah's family members finding the formula for genetic tampering? Yeah, we'll see that later on in this study too. But basically, um, some people believe there was a second incursion. Another group of fallen angels came and did the same thing again. And that would explain the post-flood giants. That may or may not have occurred. There's no record that it occurred. There is a record of the pre-flood stuff, and that's what we're studying now here. But there is a record of Canaan going and finding some of the manuscripts, figuring them out, and then trying to start up the system again. And the next thing you know is that there are giants in the land of Canaan. So apparently he was successful. So it's an interesting story. That's what we're kind of seeing here on Enoch. And this is all still pre flood. So it looks like from those things that we looked at earlier, it looks like people tried to get in on the same thing. When you combine Jasher and the other stuff, if the angels are having success doing it, and you learn it's basically some horses and some mules and then some of this and some of that and certain herbs to prevent a spontaneous abortion and then some of this, and you could try to do some of the same things, but somehow it doesn't come out the same. But apparently it worked somewhat, where it wouldn't, they wouldn't be saying it didn't come out the same. So yeah, I find it hard to know if God's going to wipe this stuff out so that it not occur again, that he would allow one of the wives of like Ham or somebody to have Nephilim DNA. Now, according to some of the old texts, the three wives of Ham, Shem, and Japheth were the three daughters of Eliakim, which is like uncle, or great uncle or something like that, three daughters. So it's in the family. And it seems to indicate that it's perfect genetically. And there's other texts we're going to see in Enoch later on that all the Nephilim died in the flood. None of them survived. So if Ham's wife was partially Nephilim or had something like that, I would think she wouldn't have survived. I mean, that's my speculation. It could be. But there's texts that paint a slightly different story or go down the other direction. Now, what's obvious today, I mean, if you're mixing, I think we've all heard of like the glowing cat, which, and the glowing mouse. Got the jellyfish gene in it, so it actually glows. And they're trying to make pigs' hearts and pig lungs and stuff like that more human for human transplants and, stuff like that. Whether that's even successful or not, I think it is. But the fact that they're even trying it is going down that same path. So not to say that it's necessarily bad, but we're going down that path. We've figured out what makes a pig lung different than our lung. It's a genetic code. If we can change the code, we can modify it. That's going down that path. The scrolls would talk about that as being Nephilim medicine. If you have cancer or you have, whatever, It's because of what you're eating, what you're breathing, not eating, not breathing, and you put the herbs together, you should survive, at least to a point, and then die of old age. And so to change something, though, is something that's forbidden. Heal yourself with medicine, I mean, herbs and stuff, but you don't try to change yourself into a different species, which is where that starts to go. So, yeah, so I personally don't believe that any of Noah's family had any genetic problems. There's actually supposed to be some records of Japheth's wife that wrote some things too. So that's another subject. Super chat, $20. In recent decades, there have been many admitted human animal chimera lab experiments. That's true. I remember some of those in the mainstream news articles. It makes me wonder what is hidden in underground labs not publicized, as it was in the days of Noah. Yeah, everything that we have, the military has better. Like I'm just now beginning to get fiber. I live in my small town. We're just now beginning to get fiber internet, and a lot of places have had it for a long time. So, and the military has had that and even better for a long time. So anything that's common knowledge, like you and I, and like this broadcast and everything, somebody else has got something way more sophisticated. The You and I have a gun, just like shoots bullets. I'm sure somewhere there are weapons that make guns look like toys. So there's lots of stuff, and when we finally get to know certain things that are happening, there are a lot of stuff that are not. And see, that's what I'm saying. There might be even a law against doing that. If I remember correctly, you can experiment, but you have to destroy the embryo at 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever, 13 weeks. And I'm sure they do, and they learn a lot doing that. But even though it's legal or not legal, if China might be doing it, if Russia might be doing it, or some other superpower or whatever, we're going to be closely looking at what's going on. And it'll be whether it's legal or not, a thing of national security, which it kind of really is. It's a new kind of weapons, so to speak. So yeah, I imagine there's lots of stuff like that going on. The nice thing is that it's extremely hard to do. So it's not like they're gonna in one night just wipe everything out. What do you think about the discoveries of Ron Wyatt, primarily his claim to have found the Ark of the Covenant? Um, yeah, I don't know if he actually did or not. I've heard those stories and I don't really know anything about it. Never met the guy, so I don't really know him personally either. Question about the rapture. Do Jews don't think, or excuse me, Jews didn't drink new wine until after the new wine festival, and comparing the new wine, our new spirits, going to the new wineskins, glorified bodies. Okay, heard of this before, or have you heard of this before? That's an interesting look at it. I'm not sure about the New Wine Festival. It's talked about in the scrolls a lot, and I know it's important. And it, like the others, have to have some sort of prophetic significance. What we really need, like we have the Passover Seder, which gives you the details for the ritual, and you can see all the prophecy embedded in it. We really need some manuscript to be found that tells us how they did all the other festivals. Don't need any explanations. Just let me read what they did and I can figure it out. And that's really what we need. Otherwise, we're speculating a lot, but that's a definite possibility. It didn't click. There we go. Super chat, $10. Thank you very much. Appreciate all you guys that support us through Give, Send, Go and PayPal and super chats here. It goes a long way to supporting our ministry, and we'll be able to get more scrolls and stuff out quicker. I've been studying Genesis and I have some questions. In chapter 3, verse 6, I think you said that God gave man 120 years to repent before he sent the flood. Where did you get this information? That is in the commentary for Genesis chapter 6 in the Dead Sea Scrolls. it specifically said that he gave them time to repent, a 120-year period. And so a lot of us, when we look at that, we either think, well, it's either talking about 120 years from now, judgment's coming if you don't repent, or right now I'm making mankind only go to 120 years. And either way, it could be prophetic of 120 jubilees and stuff like that. And so just reading Genesis is like, yeah, it could be either or both. But when you look at Genesis, you can see that pre-flood, they all lived up to be 7 to 8 to 900 years. Post-flood, when you look at the first 4 generations, they all lived to be past 400. And then apparently 4 generations into it, something happened. They instantly cut the populations down in half again. So now everybody lived to be 2 something, 230, 220, something like that. And then you get Abraham at 175, and they start going down. And then 120 seems to be a standard for a long time. According to the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Essenes still live to be 120. And if we do their herbal medicine right, we should be able to also. But yeah, the specific thing about the 120 years is from the Genesis commentary in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Genesis 5:1, God created male and female. What does it mean? It just means that every creature or every group has a male and a female to be able to reproduce or continue the species. I would think. I think that's the only thing it means. Genesis 3:22 implies that God didn't want the man to know good and evil, but he also created him in his image. So why didn't God want the man to know good and evil? Probably more of understanding the difference. He probably wasn't time for him to understand yet. God probably, this is just my opinion, had a plan for him. Much like you don't want to teach a kid how to be violent, or a 5 or 10-year-old a whole bunch of sexual things. It just perverts them and messes them up. When they get to be 15 to 20, then they need to know about violence and self-sufficiency, and or before then. But I mean, there's stages. You don't want to tell a really, really young person a whole lot of something that could mess them up until they're able to handle it. And I think that's probably what's going on here. Maybe not that God didn't want him to never know it, but it wasn't time yet. And apparently, he learned about it and it did mess up. A question I was trying to answer, but would like your input. Why can God be jealous, but we cannot? Was thinking about this context based. I think the word jealous can mean multiple different things. I found the same thing was kind of interesting. The word for a grudge. We're not supposed to hold a grudge. And to me, that always meant, I don't like you. But it's a little bit stronger than that. But there is a text in the Old Testament that talks about it, and it's translated differently in King James. That's why I didn't see it for a long time. But it's the same word for holding a grudge, and it talks about God holds a grudge. And in context, what it means is God is, if you don't repent and become a believer, you will eventually die and go to hell. And say God knows that you're going to go to hell and the other guy's not, but he doesn't send you there right now. You will be punished later on. And like the nations, like the Amorites, they will be totally wiped out, but the time's not yet. So it's kind of like holding back judgment or holding a grudge. And so it's interesting. And when we do that, though, that's inappropriate. If you know someone is sinning or committing a crime, we need to fix it so people don't get hurt. You do something about it now. You tell someone, press charges, shoot the person, whatever it is you need to do, you take care of the problem so innocent people are not hurt. And so it's interesting. We're not supposed to hold a grudge, but God does. So in the same way, I'm thinking God can be jealous, but we cannot. So God, it says he's a jealous God, and that's usually referred to the concept of idolatry. God wants a relationship with us. He doesn't want you going and worshiping a rock or Zeus, Hera, and Hercules, or my ancestors or whatever. He wants you to know him. So that's a jealous God. And I think it's the same way we should be jealous of our spouse, so to speak. We wouldn't want our spouse going and having an affair with someone else. Only for us is what you would think. So that's the jealousy part. I think that's the text that we're talking about. Why does Genesis 2 seem to be a recreation of man to me? Um, I think it's because of a vast editing. People have thought that there's different, like JEPD theory and stuff like that. I reject that myself. But when you look at Genesis, just like the first 6 chapters, we're going from creation to the flood, which is 1,656 years of human history in 6 chapters. So he basically says there's creation, there was an Adam and Eve and a Cain, then there's the Lamech story, and y'all know what that is, and then there's the giant stuff, and y'all know what that is, and then he's just kind of giving a real brief synopsis because he's trying to hurry up and get to Abraham because that's where they started. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the nation of Israel, and then Moses, and then so he's trying to give a real brief synopsis. So we do the same thing, or they did the same thing in the New Testament, if you think about it. It starts off with just a chapter or two. Here's the genealogy. Here's Adam to Jesus Christ. Now let's get started. And then we start with Christ and go on. And so I think it's probably something like that. I don't think it's 2 separate accounts or a garbled of anything. I think it's just a very shortened version. And it sounds like that, I think, in English more than in Hebrew. Who are the 3 shepherds in Zechariah 11? I'm not exactly sure. I've wondered that a lot. I think we'll eventually be able to figure it out with the scrolls, hopefully. Question. The woman with the basket has the stork wings, which are unclean. In Revelation, it talks about the woman who is given eagle wings. Eagles are also unclean. What is the implications, if any, of the two together? I don't know. An eagle, and it depends. It seems like it's almost like an interchangeable thing. It could be an eagle like what we think, which is still unclean, but an eagle is like the biggest bird, the fastest bird, the strongest bird. If you mean vulture, which it could, vultures are unclean. They eat things. They just sit around. So in context, she's given eagle wings to fly swiftly somewhere where she's protected. And it might just mean that. But it is interesting to think about eagles being unclean. That could mean a Gentile power. It could mean a lot of stuff. But I'm not really sure if there's a direct connection to that. In our one of the things we're trying to do, get there real quick, at our website, BibleFacts.org, we have we're doing PDFs, files, and stuff like that, and Dead Sea Scroll studies, just manuscripts. But we have prophecy charts here. I'll eventually put these together in like a prophecy book, but I'm trying to show different things. Like here's Noah's dream, here's Daniel 2, the dragon heads of Revelation, and here's the Zechariah 5 one. And so the whole idea, it says that the woman is put in a basket. The basket is sealed with lead and taken and put in a temple or a house in Shinar, which is Babylon, until it's ready for her, like the harlot system comes out. And she's taken there by 2 stork women. And I always thought of storks as having white wings. Some do, some don't. There's also black wings. They're unclean. And so just to put this together to have a picture of something. And then this is the symbol that comes from the Book of Gad. And you can tell these two are related, the 2 stork women with the camel and the donkey. There's a specific, and we don't know all the details to it, but we're getting more and more information in the prophecies. So if you guys are interested, you can always download those and print them out. So just FYI. But I'm not sure if they are related directly or not. And let's see, a couple more questions. Did any angels fall after the flood era? Not that I know of, at least not in the same way. We had Lucifer's fall, then Azazel's fall, and then Shemyaza with the 200. There is a text in Enoch, actually, later on, that talks about the punishment was so swift and so severe, the angels didn't dare do that again. That doesn't mean they couldn't fall some other way, but it's an interesting thought. So some people think there were other incursions or other things, so maybe, but there's no direct information about that, and it seems to indicate that that didn't happen. $50 super chat. Thank you for all your hard work. Thank you very much for supporting us. We appreciate that. Okay, we'll go ahead and stop there for tonight. Next week, we'll look at the second half of the Book of Giants. If you're interested in the book, it's there on Amazon. You can always go to our website and go to our bookstore. These are just links that take you to Amazon. So you're just buying them off of Amazon. So we've got all of our stuff there. But thank you for the support, the questions, helping us study, and we're all learning together. And these scrolls, I think, are going to really, really help us to understand all the details that have been hidden for so long. So anyway, thank you guys. We will see you next week. God bless.